That man was Thomas James, a Welsh lawyer who went to sea and became a skilled navigator and explorer. He sailed to the north of Canada, but he was neither the first to do so, nor was he the most successful explorer. So how was it that he became one of the most celebrated of his time?
It's because he did what other explorers of his time hadn't done. He didn't just write a factual report of his voyage, he wrote a thrilling adventure book. And the reading public loved it.
It became a bestseller of the time. It has even been claimed that his dramatic prose inspired the famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Captain Thomas James was born in about 1593 into a well-to-do family right here at Wern-y-Cwm farm in the shadow of the Skirrid Mountain in Monmouthshire.
Thomas evidently qualified as a barrister in London, but if he ever practiced law, it wasn't for long, for soon enough he went to sea.
In 1628 he was appointed captain of a privateer ship, so by that time he must have proven himself a very capable seaman.
At this time the merchants of London were busily preparing an expedition to search for the Northwest Passage. If they found it, they'd have a lucrative monopoly of the route, a much faster way to reach the Orient than sailing around the south of the African and South American continents. A man called Luke Fox was made commander of the London expedition. News of this venture greatly worried traders of the Bristol Society of Merchant Venturers. The last thing they wanted was to be shut out of a valuable new trade route. A rival expedition was prepared. A ship had to be found and a man to captain it. Thomas James was appointed as a man skilled in navigation and knowledge of mathematical science.
The Bristol merchants suggested that instead of a competition with London, the discovery of the route should be a shared benefit. Thomas was sent to London to present a petition to this effect to the king. He explained it all to Charles and, no doubt using his lawyerly skills, he got the permission that was needed.
Thomas got to work. He read everything he could lay his hands on about previous expeditions. He sought the advice of Welsh explorer Sir Thomas Button, who had led his own expedition in 1612. A small but manoeuvrable ship of 70 tons was acquired and provisioned for a very long journey. It was renamed the Henrietta Maria as a tribute to King Charles's French queen. Thomas advertised for a crew of 22 who had to be in good health and unmarried.
The ship sailed on the 3rd of May 1633 at 3 p.m. and on board was a letter that King Charles wanted handed to the Emperor of Japan.
But Thomas had not picked a fine day for sailing in the Bristol Channel. The weather was rough, and so it continued. It took a month to reach Greenland. At a place called Cape Desolation, Thomas noted, "We were much tormented, pestered, and beaten with the ice. There was a stinking fog, and the sea very black." At night they were terrified by a hollow and hideous noise, as huge banks of ice were grinding together. There were icebergs taller than the mast of the ship. They ran onto rocks, but miraculously the ship was freed without much damage. There was much praying and thanking of God as they survived multiple hazards.
Onwards they sailed into Hudson Bay. Ice blocked their way to the north, so they sailed south and sought a route out to the west. But they found none. The ship became locked in ice, and they decided to make the most of it.
Thomas later recalled, "We went all boldly out upon the ice to sport and recreate ourselves." Freed with a lot of effort, they again ran onto rocks, and again they got away with it. They passed Port Nelson, a place named by Sir Thomas Button when he had wintered there.
Then came a tragedy. An anchor cable fouled a rope on deck, and it caught the leg of the ship's gunner.
Thomas wrote, He had his leg taken betwixt the cable and the capstan, which wrung off his foot, and tore all the flesh off his leg, and crushed the bone to pieces.
The ship's surgeon amputated the man's leg. He lingered for a few weeks and died. His body was slipped into the sea. In late August, the Henrietta Maria met up with a London ship under Captain Fox. Thomas invited Fox to dine with him. It was an awkward meeting.
Thomas said he had named an area in the west of Hudson's Bay as the South Principality of Wales. Fox responded that he had called the same area Yorkshire, from where he came. Fox sailed home, but Thomas carried on exploring. His ship sailed to the very south of Hudson's Bay, to a bay within, now called James Bay, after the Welsh captain. Thomas named a place en route Cape Henrietta Maria.
It was decided to set up winter quarters. The Henrietta Maria was anchored in fairly shallow water, and it was decided, whether wisely or not is a matter of debate, to partially sink her so that she would not be crushed by ice or swept away by the tides.
At that time, Thomas wrote, "Our men were almost dead with cold and sorrows. We looked upon each other with woeful hearts."
They made huts for the winter of logs wrapped with the ship's sails. The weather was freezing, there was deep snow. It was a desperately uncomfortable winter. Shoes had disintegrated and many of the men had to wrap their feet in cloths. Some went out hunting, and after the accident with the gunner came another tragedy, this time with the gunner's mate.
John Barton had attempted to go over a pond that was a quarter of a mile over, where, when he was in the very middle, the ice braked and closed upon him, and we never saw him more. Predictably, with the lack of fresh food, scurvy erupted. Many of our men complained of infirmities, some of sore mouths, all the teeth in their heads being loose, their gums swollen, with black rotten flesh, which must every day be cut away. They caught foxes and boiled them into a broth for the weakest men. Some feared that the Henrietta Maria could not be sailed again, and that they were doomed. It was a desperate time. Thomas, a very religious man, told them to look on the bright side. At least they had the time to repent before the heavenly life to come.
In the weeks that followed, 3 crewmen died of cold and disease. There was also quite a shocking incident. There at the side of the ship one day was the body of the gunner who had died in the accident 6 months earlier and whose body had been slipped into the sea far away. They recovered his remains and buried them on land.
Thomas wrote of the general feeling of misery. In the spring, the ice receded, and that should have brought relief. Instead, there was a new problem: vast clouds of biting insects, butcher's flies, horse flies, and bloodthirsty mosquitoes. The men wore bags on their heads to try to get relief, but in vain. Thomas wrote that the suffering was even worse than the intense cold of winter. Then, on top of it all, another disaster struck. A signal fire was lit, and the flames spread to the wooden huts, badly damaging them.
The ship was refloated by those men who were fit enough to do the work, but she was in a desperate condition. They sailed north, but were met by that familiar barrier of ice. Months passed by, another cold winter loomed, and Thomas asked the men what they wanted to do. They wanted to go home.
The ramshackle Henrietta Maria struggled back across the Atlantic. She had cracked timbers and some of her keel was missing, but 18 months after leaving Bristol, she returned on the 22nd of October, 1632. Witnesses marvelled that it had been possible to get such an unseaworthy vessel back across the ocean. A few weeks later, Thomas was in London and personally briefed King Charles. The king must have been disappointed at the lack of success, but he was evidently enthralled by the story of the voyage. He wanted a book written about it. Thomas got to work immediately. The book was published a few months later. It was called The Strange and Dangerous Voyage of Captain Thomas James. Most earlier accounts of voyages to find the Northwest Passage tended to be dry as dust ship's logs. Thomas had done something very different. He had written an adventure book. It was filled with storms, hardships, looming disasters, and amazing escapes. This might once have been called a ripping yarn, and readers loved it.
Thomas became quite famous. The great and the good sought out his company to hear at first hand about his thrilling adventure, and his book remained popular for decades.
But he was a serious sort. He wanted to get back to sea. He was made captain of a Royal Navy ship tasked with clearing pirates from the Bristol Channel. He did a very good job and seemed all set for major promotion in the Navy. But in 1635 he was struck down by an illness and died. He was around 42 years old.
As for claims that Thomas's book inspired the epic poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, well, it is possible that Coleridge read the book in Bristol Library, but it has to be emphasised that there are other claims of inspiration for his work.
The Rime of the Ancient Mariner certainly contains imagery similar to that of the book. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound.
The fame of Captain Thomas James dwindled in subsequent centuries, and although he did not find the fabled Northwest Passage, he did discover a way to tell a thrilling, real-life story that captivated the reading public.